I'm Anne Woollett, curator of paintings at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are connecting with us remotely, and also those who are seated here with me in the Harold Williams Auditorium at the Getty Center in Los Angeles. Before I introduce the program and our distinguished guest, I would like to share a few practical details for attendees on Zoom. To access the live captioning function, please click the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. Also, feel free to submit questions anytime during the conversation through the Q&A function. For our guests here in the auditorium, and I'm absolutely thrilled to see you here in person, we ask that you hold your questions until the end of the program and then make your way to the two standing mics here at the bottom of the stairs. With this hybrid program, we have the best of both worlds, and I'd like to thank the marvelous team who made it possible: Greg, Daniele, Gus, Heather, and the entire AV team. Well, just a few days ago, the exhibition Holbein Capturing Character in the Renaissance opened here at the Getty in galleries not far from this auditorium. After long months of closure, it's absolutely thrilling to see these beautiful works together and with others in person. This exhibition of works by the talented and ingenious German artist Hans Holbein the Younger will be on view here at the Getty until January 9th. And then it will be presented at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York with our superb partners from February 11th to May 15th, 2022. I very much hope that many of you will see it here or in New York, or perhaps even ideally in both institutions. The exhibition examines Holbein's very remarkable and singular contributions to portraiture and the construction of visual forms of personal identity in Basel and London. The display opens with the striking, I would say iconic, portrait of a woman holding a pet squirrel and accompanied by a starling. This work epitomizes not only Holbein's spectacular painting technique, but his skills as a designer and his process of creating likenesses. She is an excellent ambassadress for his art. Today, we will delve into the intriguing aspects of this painting with the scholar who knows it best, the keeper of the squirrel, Dr. Susan Foister. Susan is Deputy Director and Director of Collections at the National Gallery in London. She is a distinguished expert on German Renaissance painting and wrote her PhD dissertation on Hans Holbein the Younger and his English patrons. And she was the curator of the very important and captivating exhibition Holbein in England in 2006 that was held at the Tate Britain. I think we have no better guide to this work. We've had the pleasure of working with Susan here with us as a guest scholar. And at that time, we discussed, amongst various topics, the Getty's marvelous panel by Holbein, An Allegory of Passion, to which she brought a greater clarity and understanding. A desire to illuminate the context and role of this fascinating work provided the impetus for the current exhibition. Susan, thank you so very much for joining us here today from London at dinner time on a Saturday.
Thank you, Anne. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're absolutely thrilled to see you, and thank you. Please tell us more about Holbein's compelling portrait.
I will indeed, and thank you for inviting me to talk about one of my favorite works of art. The lady with a squirrel and a starling, which we believe to represent Anne Lovell. So before I talk about the portrait, the woman, and the animal and the bird in this painting, I just want to refresh your memories a little bit about the artist, Hans Holbein the Younger. Here he is in his self-portrait, looking rather formidable and I think a bit inscrutable. And I think that that's perhaps how he managed to keep afloat through a very turbulent period of European history and have such a successful career as an international artist. As Anne mentioned, he was a German, born in Augsburg in 1497 or 1498, but when he was still a young man, he came to work in Basel in Switzerland. Then he made his first visit to England from 1526 to 1528, and that we think is the period in which our portrait of Anne Lovell was painted. He then went back to Basel, but came back to England again by 1532, and he died in London in 1543. And of course, his most famous patron was King Henry VIII. Holbein became his favorite, relied upon court artist, producing portraits for him, such as this small jewel-like one that you see on the left, and then this large life-size portrait of Henry in this famous but lost painting, a wall painting at Whitehall Palace, lost when the palace burned down in 1697. But it was that full-length image of Henry looking straight at us that really launched 1,000 images of Henry, the image by which we know him today, the one produced by Holbein. Now, Holbein had some very powerful friends, and it was through the humanist Erasmus, who you see on the right, that he got to know when he was living and working in Basel, that he had the entree to court circles in London. And here you see on the left his portrait of Sir Thomas More, painted in 1527. The two humanists were friends, and Erasmus recommended Holbein to Thomas More in London. And here is another of Holbein's very powerful patrons, Thomas Cromwell. Both Cromwell and Sir Thomas More owned portraits owned by the Frick collection, and usually can be seen wonderfully hanging facing each other across a fireplace there. So these are all portraits of powerful men. So I want to turn now to the portrait of Anne Lovell, still identified just with a question mark, but we'll explore the reasons for identifying her as we go. I want to focus first of all on the very distinctive animal and birds that she is portrayed with in this beautiful portrait. She's shown with a small red squirrel. Now, we don't see many red squirrels here in London today. We see lots of larger gray squirrels, which have become a bit of a pest, I have to say. The red squirrels are now these days confined to the north of Scotland. But Holbein undoubtedly had access to a squirrel, a bright-eyed squirrel that we can see here just perched on the arm of Anne Lovell, with a chain, as you'll see here, that suggests that he was a pet. Now, I just want to show you how Holbein has actually managed to paint and capture this little squirrel. Here you can see that he's actually chewing on a nut. And here you can see that bright eye, that dab of white paint that's produced, that brightness of the eye, large, dark eye. And then the whiskers, you can see dark on the lighter brown on the right over the fur, and then illuminated brighter over the dark background of Anne Lovell's black dress on the left. And now I'm going to show you one of my favorite images taken through the microscope by my colleague, Rachel Billinge. This is the fur on the squirrel's belly. It looks like treacle, the way that Holbein has brushed the wet paint, the darker paint above, into the strokes that he's created in white for the white fur of the squirrel below. Beautiful, very, very fast painting. And here another detail of the squirrel's claws and the chain just above. Holbein was a very economical painter. You can see he's just to create that chain, he's just working with white highlights. The dark background isn't defined in any way. He's working swiftly, as he so often does, to create this portrait. And now the starling, perched on the left on a branch. Beautiful bird with iridescent plumage. Now here again, you can see just that thick dab of white paint creating the gleam in the starling's eye. And you can also see how Holbein has used the blue background, this rather grainy blue pigment azurite, to create a sense of the iridescence of the starling's plumage. There you can see him working fast again in great detail, the highlights of the feathers of the starling, those little white patches. And there the longer feathers of the wings, those beautiful long brown strokes, very, very varied brown colors, again with a sense of blue iridescence on them. And there is the claw of the starling as it perches, I must say, very precariously on this branch. And we'll come back a little later to what actually this branch is here. So why the squirrel and why the starling? Well, there are a few other portraits in which Holbein has included animals. This is one of them, the portrait of Robert Cheeseman, painted in 1533. And he's holding here a falcon perched on his arm. You can see the little bell that's attached to its foot just above his glove. Obviously, he's wearing a glove because he doesn't want to be harmed by the claws of the bird. And he's just touching its feathered breast. Holbein paints those feathers so beautifully as he does the starling in our portrait. And at the moment, the bird is hooded. It can't see, and he'll take that hood off to let it fly. Now, the people associated with falcons were always noblemen. You had to be very high in status to own a falcon and let it fly about. To go hunting with a falcon was certainly a sign of nobility. Now, Cheeseman was not a nobleman, but it's almost certain that he was the falconer to King Henry VIII. So that is why he's shown here with this beautiful bird. And Holbein shows a similar bird, a hawk, again used for hunting, in this slightly later portrait of a man. We assume he's a nobleman, but we don't know his exact identity. There you can see that he's taken off the hood and the hawk is looking out to the left where his owner looks straight ahead at us. And again, he's got that little bell just attached to his foot. And you can see, again, the claws stretched over that leather glove that the man is wearing. I also love these beautiful little touches of red in his black doublet that he's wearing. Now, two powerful men with their birds. This is something different. It's not an oil painting either. It's a watercolor by Holbein of a young boy. We don't know quite where this was made, whether it was made in Basel, in England, or even perhaps in France. But this little boy, very well dressed, is cradling a little monkey, a marmoset, a type of monkey that was often kept as a pet in this time. And here I'm showing you a drawing that Holbein made for his portrait of Sir Thomas More and his family. Another life-size work by Holbein that unfortunately was lost. It hasn't come down to us, but we do have this wonderfully vivid drawing, which is also annotated partly by Holbein himself. And I want you to look at the lower right-hand corner of this drawing where Thomas More's wife is kneeling. And I wonder if you can just see, not in the black ink, but in the brown ink, the outlines of a little monkey with its long tail that's just jumping up to try to disturb her. She seems to be at her prayers, but the monkey is trying to get her attention. So the men are shown with very different animals from the child and the woman here. And squirrels were very much, we know, kept as pets in this period, as that little chain seems to indicate. The squirrel was perhaps Anne Lovell's own pet. But there may be another reason that Holbein has included the squirrel in this portrait. And this may be the clue to the identity of the woman in this portrait. Now, I always think that the origins of this knowledge lies in lending paintings to exhibitions, which I think is an extremely good thing to do. It was when this painting was in another exhibition in London that it was seen by the stained glass historian David King, who came to see me at the National Gallery to tell me of his thoughts, his discovery from looking at stained glass in a church in Norfolk. Now, he had noticed, looking carefully at our portrait, which he hadn't seen before at the time, that the squirrel is perched with its tail in the air, nibbling on a nut. And he had just been studying stained glass in a Norfolk church in East Harling, seeing everywhere red squirrels, bright red squirrels, as you can see here, nibbling nuts with their tails in the air. Now, he knew that this glass was the heraldic glass of the Lovell family. So he had formed the idea that this lady, who at that time was completely unidentified, might actually be a member of the Lovell family, and as we'll see, might actually be somebody called Anne Lovell. And he also had a possible reason for the inclusion of the Starling. Now, East Harling Church, I should explain, Norfolk is a county about 120 miles north of London. It's a very rural county still today. It's full of wonderful churches. And in East Harling, well, if you say a starling very quickly, and apparently it helps if you have a Norfolk accent, East Starling, is that a pun for a starling? So perhaps both the squirrel and the starling are there as representatives of East Harling in Norfolk and of the Lovell family. And just to drive home the point about birds a little bit further, here on the left is the first book written in England about birds, published in 1544 by someone called William Turner. And in this book, he actually refers to a man called Sir Francis Lovell, the husband of Anne Lovell, who he says is responsible for the name of the shrike, the bird that you can see on the right. Now, I'm not absolutely sure that that really does hold water, but it is very intriguing that Francis Lovell is mentioned in this book about birds. Now, let's talk a little bit more about Anne herself, what we know about her, and why her portrait might have been made. Now, if we delve into what we know about Anne Lovell, there isn't a great deal to be found in the historical documents, but there are connections to be made. And as usual in this period, they're connections to be made through men that were important in her life. Now, Anne Lovell was actually born Anne Ashby, and her father, George, was quite an important man at the court, clerk of the signet to Henry VIII. And he died in 1515, when she must have been still a young girl. We don't know when she was born. And in his will, her father obviously hoped that she would marry well, because he left her £50 towards her marriage and a gold cup with the letter A on it. and marry she did. She married Francis Lovell. Now, Francis was an up-and-coming young man in Norfolk, and as we'll see, at court. And they are both buried at East Harling, this beautiful church in Norfolk. The tombstone of Anne Lovell, says that she died in 1539, when she must have been still pretty young. Perhaps, we don't know, of some childbirth-related illness or death. Francis Lovell has a tomb inside the church, as well as the stained glass we've just seen. And on his tomb are the coats of arms of both the Lovell and the Ashby family. So the connection between the Lovells and the Ashbys is pretty clear indeed. Now, Anne and Francis, we think, married in about 1524. And then in about 1526, the year that Holbein came to London for the first time, she gave birth to their son, Thomas. And the reason that he was called Thomas seems to be because of this man, Sir Thomas Lovell, who was a relative of the young Francis and who died in 1524. He was an immensely powerful man. He was Speaker of the House of Commons in Parliament, and he also had an important role as a squire of the body to Henry VIII. And he was a very, very wealthy man, and he left his estates to Francis Lovell, who immediately became a very rich young man. And we suppose that it was after Thomas Lovell's death that Anne and Francis were able to marry, and probably then to live between London and Norfolk. They had immense ambitions for their young son, Thomas. So we can follow some of these in some letters between Francis and Lord Lisle in the 1530s. And Lord Lisle was a descendant of the Plantagenet family. Now, you may even be surprised to know that there were any Plantagenets still about in the period of the powerful Tudors, and they weren't to last for very long because Lord Lisle was executed. But at this time, Francis Lovell was very keen to arrange a marriage between Lord Lisle's daughter and his son Thomas, even though they were only small children at this time. Well, it didn't happen. Anne died in 1539, Francis died in 1552, and their son Thomas lived on into adulthood. But I think the wealth that Francis gained from Thomas explains not only perhaps the rather beautiful clothing that Anne is wearing, that fur hat, which must have been very expensive fur. It may be ermine, it may be a fur called lettuce, it may be a fur called miniver, but they were all very expensive white, pure white furs. And her black dress is trimmed with velvet. So although she looks as though she's presented quite simply, she is, in fact, a rich woman. Now, there are a few other Norfolk people that were portrayed by Holbein, people with quite important court connections that the Lovells may well have known, in some cases certainly did know. Here's Holbein's portrait painted in 1528 of Sir Thomas and John Godself. It's a little portrait. They were people of slightly more modest means, but they were very, very ambitious. Thomas, you can see to the right, he's writing there. He was from Norwich, which is the major town in the county of Norfolk, and he was extremely ambitious for his son, John, on the left. And he pretty quickly got writing to his contact, Thomas Cromwell, and got John and got Thomas on the road, got John, sorry, on the road to success at court. So perhaps the Lovells recommended Holbein to the Godselfs. That seems perhaps more likely than the other way round. Now, someone in Norfolk that they certainly did know well is this man, Sir Thomas Lestrange, who was drawn by Holbein a little bit later, we think, in the 1530s. It seems quite soon after Anne had given birth to Thomas in the spring of 1526 that they went on a visit, perhaps a bit of a progress around Norfolk, visiting different friends. In June 1526, they visited Sir Thomas Lestrange at his family seat at Hunstanton, which is on the northern coast of Norfolk. So he was certainly a friend, and perhaps they recommended Holbein to him as a portraitist. And then finally, the Duke of Norfolk himself, Thomas, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, an immensely powerful man at the court of Henry VIII. You can see him here wearing the Order of the Garter around his ermine-lined coat. Now, he certainly would have known Frances and Anne Lovell. And the families kept up their connections. We know that Thomas Lovell, the son, knew Thomas the 4th Duke of Norfolk, and it may even have been through these connections that at the end of the 16th century, we think the portrait of Anne was sold out of the Lovell family and sold to descendants of this man, the Duke of Norfolk. Now, we've seen the portrait that we think is Anne. We haven't seen a portrait of Frances. And as far as we know, Holbein did not create a portrait of Frances. Now, in some other cases, Holbein certainly did create portraits of a man and his wife. Now, just note for a moment that Anne here is looking to the right. Now, here is an absolutely splendid pair of portraits which Holbein made in 1527, which was probably the year in which he also painted Anne Lovell. On the left is the courtier, Sir Henry Gilford, absolutely resplendent in cloth of gold, wearing the Order of the Garter. And on the right is his wife, Mary Wootton, Lady Gilford, also resplendent in black velvet and cloth of gold with that beautiful Renaissance carved decorative pillar in the background. And you'll notice also that those beautifully curling sprays of leaves against the blue background, which are very similar to the portrait of Anne. Now, there's a bit of a convention in Renaissance portraits of men and women, and usually you find the portrait of the man on the left and the portrait of the woman on the right. And we notice that Anne Lovell is not facing in the same direction as Lady Gilford, towards her husband on the left, which was usually regarded as the more important side in the Renaissance. Anne is facing the other way. But let's take a look at these drawings of Margaret of Barrow, Lady Elliot, and her humanist husband, Sir Thomas Elliot, on the right-hand side. Now, we just have the drawings for these portraits. We don't have painted portraits which survive. And then these, you can see here that Lady Elliot is looking in exactly the same direction as Anne Lovell. Now, we don't know exactly the reason for that. Possibly in some cases, one portrait was made first and then another portrait was added to it later on. So we can't completely exclude the possibility that Holbein also painted Sir Francis Lovell, but there's no evidence that such a portrait existed. What I do want to draw your attention to is this rather beautiful representation of Lady Elliot on the left. those rather deep set and pale eyes, her rather sparse eyebrows, her just slightly protruding nose, and her slightly frightened expression. Also, the white highlighting towards the left is quite strong. It almost gives the impression, I think, that her skin is rather taut and perhaps even a little bit greasy. It's not at all an idealized portrait. It's a portrait of a very specific woman, something that I think Holbein absolutely excels at, and which is very unusual in this period in which Renaissance portraits of women were usually idealized, strongly idealized. Let's take a look at another couple of portraits, portrait drawings by Holbein. This one of Mary Zouche. Now, we're not absolutely certain that this is the woman at court who was a lady in waiting known as Mary Zouche. If it is, she was known as quite a beauty at court. To my 21st century eyes, she does look like a beautiful woman. Holbein has taken great care with his colored chalks to represent her golden hair and her coral lips. But notice also the expression here. She's shown full face, but her eyes are sliding to one side. Is that because she's just seen somebody? We don't know. It gives that impression of a capturing of a moment. I think Holbein does that extremely well here. And then another of my favorite drawings, this very beautiful and detailed drawing of a woman. We don't know who she is. There's something slightly strange about the outlines of this drawing you may be able to see, and that's because at some point somebody has decided to silhouette this drawing, to cut it out and stick it on another piece of paper. But I don't think that detracts at all from the beautiful detail that Holbein has given us. Look particularly at her eyebrows and the attention that he's paid to each of those eyebrows, the different ways in which the brows are lying, the strands of hair depicted. And again, with her eyelashes, he doesn't always depict the lower eyelashes, but here you can see them quite clearly, especially on the right-hand side. I think you can also see here that Holbein is always very careful not to depict faces exactly symmetrically. Even when we're looking at them full face, you can see that the left eye is larger than the right. The mouth here is depicted with this beautiful ink line, which is tremendously varied. It's so far from a straight line. Again, this woman, we don't know who she is, but she is beautifully individualized. As I think is Anne herself. Now, Holbein has made a few adjustments. You may even be able to see them in this enlarged image. If you look at her temples to the left of her eye on the left, can you see perhaps that Holbein has just altered her hairline? Now, originally, it was a bit further down her temple, but he's tidied it up and he's pushed it back under her cap. And the cap itself he adjusted slightly. It's harder to see, but in fact, the flap on the right was a bit larger originally, but he's decided to reduce that a bit. So he is designing this portrait. He is not just reproducing what he sees. So I want now just to look a little bit more at how Holbein did make his portraits and what we can tell about the way in which this portrait was made. Now, we have one important document that gives us a great insight into the way in which Holbein may have gone about making his portraits. Now, I've just shown you some drawings that Holbein made of women. And we think that in general, Holbein did make drawings, and then he used those to create his paintings. So he may not have needed very long with his sitter if he was just creating a drawing, and then he would probably trace through the outlines of his drawing particularly to get the likeness of the head and the details and the proportion of the face. But the one document that gives us greatest insight into his methods survives in connection with this portrait, also in the National Gallery, the full-length portrait of Christina of Denmark. Now, we know that in March 1538, Holbein was commanded by King Henry VIII, his employer, to go to Brussels to take the portrait of the 16-year-old Christina of Denmark. Henry had heard she was extremely beautiful and he was interested in marrying her, but he wanted a reliable portrait of her. So Holbein, we're told in a whole series of fascinating letters, went to Brussels and was ushered into a room where Christina was waiting. And he had 3 hours with her. We know that for sure. What we don't know, of course, is whether this was usual or exceptional, whether he spent 3 hours with Anne Lovell or with other people at the court of Henry VIII, or whether his time with them was shorter or longer. Obviously, with Christina, that visit to Brussels was a short one, and soon afterwards, he was back in London showing Henry something. We're not quite sure what. It probably was not this full-length finished oil painting. It was probably a series of drawings. So he must have made, for sure, a drawing of Christina's face. You see here, again, that lack of symmetry in the face. He probably made a drawing of her hands. She was supposed to have very beautiful hands. The hands in Holbein's portraits aren't always so individualized, but here they perhaps are. And it might have been a drawing like this one, this study of the hands of Erasmus. You can see this very outline, quick sketch of the face of Erasmus on the left, and then this rather detailed and beautiful chalk study, the hands on the right. And perhaps he made a drawing like this one for the portrait of Anne. Now, this is another woman wearing a rather similar fur cap. This is, in fact, we know, one of the daughters of Sir Thomas More, so it was probably a study for that group portrait for which we saw the drawing earlier. It's not Anne Lovell, although sometimes the two have been confused. And he perhaps made studies of starlings and of squirrels. And possibly a drawing like this, a study of the dress. It's interesting that it shows both the front and the back of the dress. So if he was making a portrait, he would only have needed to see the dress from one angle, from the front or the side. He wouldn't have needed to see the back. But this suggests that he needed to understand how this English woman's dress was constructed in order to create a portrait. So perhaps Holbein made a study of the dress of Anne. But Holbein was very good at working portraits up from bare details and sometimes changing details. So I'm showing you on the right here his drawing of Queen Jane Seymour. It's really an outline drawing, particularly as far as the dress is concerned. There's more detail in the face. Then next to it is a portrait in Vienna in which she's wearing rather different jewelry. It's a much more detailed, of course, and elaborate finished oil painting. And then on the left is Jane in that Whitehall wall painting, or the copy of the Whitehall wall painting that we saw earlier on. And here her dress and her jewels are completely different, much more elaborate. Often what may have happened in these cases is that Holbein made the sketch of the face, and then he was lent the clothing that he could study separately for the portrait. Perhaps in this case, one of Jane Seymour's ladies in waiting even models the clothing for Holbein. So perhaps with the portrait of Anne Lovell, Perhaps he was given the clothes or the hat that she was to wear and studied them separately. He certainly studied the fur hat very, very intently, as you can see here. Now, whichever animal it was whose fur makes up this fur hat, the hat was made up of lots and lots of very tiny little pelts. I think you can see here how they're all joined together. So they're very tiny pieces of fur. You can get a better idea perhaps here from this detail. And look at the way that Holbein tremendously varies the colors that he's using, from that quite deep shadowed brown on the left to the much brighter white with the light falling on the right. And here again is one of my colleague Rachel's microscopic details. And there you can see Holbein's brush strokes with this immense gradation of grays and browns, very carefully seeking to give that effect of the joining up of those little pelts. And this is a detail from the edge of Anne Lovell's shawl, that beautiful folded white shawl. You can see here it was made up of several layers of fabric folded together. But Holbein has created the edge of the fabric here, not by using the end of his brush as usual, but by using the wooden end of the brush. And he has sort of carved out the sense of the edge of that shawl by using, as it were, the wrong end of the brush. Now, I just want to come back for a moment to that portrait of Lady Gilford that we saw earlier, and the drawing for it on the left. Now you can see here, Holbein must have started with this drawing in which he's glancing to the left, and then he changed the position of her eyes and made her look a great deal sterner in the finished portrait. We know that Holbein traced the outlines of this drawing through directly to make the portrait, and he simply changed the direction of the eyes. So Holbein could change dress, he could change facial expressions. There was a great deal that he could do when he didn't have his sitter in front of him. Now, we've been able to look through the painted surface of our portrait, as you can see here. This is an infrared reflectogram, so you're looking through the painted surface and you're seeing the black outlines that Holbein made before he started to paint. You can see that particularly well with the outlines of the shawl here. Now, if you look at her hands, lower right on the image here, it looks rather confused. There's light and dark. There seems to be rather a lot going on. And what seems to have happened is that Holbein here changed the position of Anne Lovell's arm and hands considerably, because at the very last minute, he was asked to add the squirrel. Now, we don't know why, but originally Anne was wearing a belt with a little metal hoop, and her arm was much lower down. Her hands may even have been clenched. So it was very much a last minute change to maneuver her arm upwards and to create this rather beautiful cupping of the hands with the chain just threaded through them. So we've seen that Holbein can change what he shows us, that what he presents us is perhaps not what he originally saw. We've seen that there may be two reasons for presenting the squirrel here. It may be Anne's pet, and it may also stand for the heraldry of the Lovell family. So I want just to finish by exploring a few more ways in which Holbein creates meanings and ambiguity in this and other portraits. Now, certainly squirrels were kept as pets at this time. And here I'm showing you a page from a 14th century manuscript, the Luttrell Psalter, with this beautiful little image at the bottom. It's rather like a cartoon image, and it shows a medieval lady playing with her pet squirrel. And there are actually other squirrels in this manuscript. So certainly it would not have been unusual for a lady to be shown with a pet squirrel. Now, this is another image, an allegorical image by another German artist. And it's an image which portrays a woman as diligence, as the attribute of diligence. And on the right-hand side, upper right, on that shield, you can see a squirrel. So the squirrel eating its nut and storing its nuts away for the winter when no nuts will be found is an image here representing the virtue of diligence. Now, I'm not sure that diligence features in Anne Lovell's portrait, but it's interesting that in America, there are many portraits, particularly from the 18th and 19th centuries, and particularly of children, in which squirrels do seem to feature as a sign of diligence. And obviously, if you were a child, I think your parents would want you to be diligent. So this is another aspect of the meaning of squirrels. But there's yet another aspect to the squirrel. And I'm showing you here the inner side of a 15th century gold ring, a French ring. And I hope you can see inside on the left the image of the medieval lady holding a chain, and at the end of the chain is a rather large image of a squirrel leaping forward. It's a slightly comic image, but this is a love ring. And the inscription on the outside in French, it's rather complicated French with grammatical puns, so I'm not going to attempt to read it or translate it for you. But there is no doubt that squirrels were associated with love in this period. They could be quite an erotic symbol. So is this what the squirrel is doing here? I do like the way in which the squirrel's tail overlaps Anne Lovell's breast, particularly the way in which that transparent veiling with that beautiful pearl fastening at the top is just a little bit opened. So you're seeing both the flesh underneath that transparent silk, which I think it is, and her chest with the squirrel's tail nestling on it. And finally, those leaves, let's just come back to those for one moment. Scholars have debated whether there are fig leaves or vine leaves in this painting. Perhaps there are both. The leaves are very like figs. The fruit that you can see there emerging is a little like a fig, and there are vine-like tendrils. But vines also produce fruits like this. I suspect that Holbein did not want to make a definitive commitment to which fruit or leaf is represented here. In the National Gallery also is this extraordinary portrait of two French ambassadors painted in 1533. We could spend the whole hour talking about this one portrait, but I just want to focus on a detail here. On the left is a globe, and on the map of France is an inscription that you wouldn't normally expect to see here. It stands for policy, which was the name of the chateau of the Frenchman on the left. So Holbein has put that in very deliberately to identify Jean de Dinteville on the left, perhaps as he deliberately put in heraldic symbolism to identify the Lovell family. And on the right are musical instruments, usually signs of harmony. But in this case, one string of the lute is broken. And that seems to denote a lack of harmony. Something is wrong with the world, or perhaps he is just drawing our attention to the fact that life comes to an end in his inclusion of this extraordinary distorted image of a skull. In his portrait of Erasmus, finally, Holbein has shown the aging humanist with a book, and on the book is an inscription referring to the labors of Hercules, the enormous scholarly effort that Erasmus has put into his life's work. And then on the book, on the shelf, in the detail you can see on the left, I hope you can just see on the edge of the book, there is also an inscription. And it challenges the viewer. It says in Latin, Hans Holbein, it's easier to be my critic than it is to imitate me. This is an extraordinary portrait of a very individual woman, but it also is a portrait which has such an intriguing series of ambiguities, such an intriguing sense of illusion. So I would now welcome your questions and your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Well, that was absolutely riveting, and I know that it has raised some further questions from our guests here with me. And for those of you who are seated here in the auditorium, please share your questions with us by coming down the stairs to the microphones at the end of the corridor there. And I have access to some of the questions that are coming through from our Zoom viewers. And while I'm having a look at those, I wanted to pose a question myself, if you don't mind, Susan. I would love to know a little bit more, because I've been thinking about when the Starling is part of the composition, and I wondered if you had concluded whether the Starling was something that came in at the same time, at the same late stage of painting, which is sort of what I was thinking by looking at the beautiful infrared image that you shared with us and that we have on one of the exhibition didactics. It appears to me the Starling is added to the vine and is maybe painted over a branch, or whether East Harling had sort of entered the composition earlier.
Well, I suspect that East Harling and the Lovell Squirrel did enter the composition both at a very late stage. Yes, you're right that the Starling does appear to be painted right over the background and the branch. Obviously, for the Squirrel, Holbein did have to make adjustments. If both the Squirrel and the Starling came in at such a late stage, I think one can only yet again wonder at the way in which Holbein managed still to create such a harmonious and beautiful composition.
I've heard some interesting comments, some from your colleagues in London, about the behavior of the Starling, and I think it's not always perceived as a friendly presence. Do you think it's speaking or singing into her ear, or do you think it's a little more aggressive?
Well, it does look as though it could be speaking directly into her ear. Yeah, we don't see so many starlings or other birds, unfortunately, around so much these days. So they're probably perhaps more welcome to us when they turn up today than they were. But yes, traditionally they've been thought of as rather noisy nuisances, starlings.
Well, we have a question that's been sent to us remotely, and I have inadvertently somewhat erased it, I'm sorry, on my pad here. But to paraphrase, one of our viewers has asked whether they're, having seen the portrayal of a squirrel in an Italian sacred setting, a chapel setting, whether the animal that we see here in Holbein's painting might have a religious connotation.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I perhaps don't know enough about Italian paintings or the Italian painting in the question to be absolutely certain about this, but I haven't encountered any squirrels in the religious context in Northern European painting. I can say, I think, fairly certainly. But that's given me some pause for thought, and I'll have to go away again and look for yet more images of squirrels. I have quite a bulging file, actually, in my cabinet of images of squirrels that people have sent me at various times.
Well, I'll capture the question properly, make sure that you have the details. Since I've been working on the Holbein project, I've been personally captivated by red squirrels, which look rather different to those that we have here in the West. And, they're so animated, these red squirrels. They seem to be zipping around all the time. So it's part of the remarkable ability that Holbein had to sort of capture a liveliness, but to also sort of still his subjects in a way. It's a moment in time when presumably this very energetic animal is brought into sort of the perfect moment, perfect formation.
Yes, I'm sure that's why everything was created separately from components in this portrait. The idea that you could have pinned down the image of a squirrel and got that to sit. Well, it'd be a bit like painting a portrait of a child, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I think Holbein must have captured the squirrel quite separately and then brought it into the portrait.
We have a question about Holbein and his workshop, perhaps. Did he work with studio assistants while he was in London?
Well, it's a good question. Officially, he was not able to employ assistants until he became an English citizen in 1541, but his court position would probably have made it possible for him to employ people. And I think the amount of wall that he had to cover in that mural painting at Whitehall, which I showed a copy at the beginning, suggests that he must certainly have employed assistants. When he was working at Greenwich in 1527 on some large paintings for a sort of entertainment that Henry was giving to a French embassy, there are lots of records of painters working alongside him, including the people that were always needed to grind your colors, because in this period, of course, you couldn't squeeze your paint out of the tube. Somebody had to go to a lot of trouble to grind it and mix it and create it from all kinds of substances you got from the pharmacist. So assistants were pretty important in this period, and I'm sure that Holbein had some.
Right, yes. A question about Holbein's drawings. How could they have been preserved in such large numbers compared perhaps with some other German artists at the period? Could the drawings have been presented to the patrons as finished works per se? Or was there a collector, a royal collector perhaps, who made a collection of his drawings?
There's a very strong reason for believing that Holbein's drawings together in a book were owned by Henry VIII, by his son Edward VI, and that book of drawings then passed to other collections. We can see it slipping in and out of collections in the late 16th century, in the 17th century, and then eventually it comes back into royal possession. So that is the reason that we are so fortunate in Holbein's case to have such a large number of drawings. And it's also the reason that nearly all of them are in the royal collection today, because it was in the royal collection that they began and in the royal collection that they ended up. And because they were in a book, I think that also helped their preservation, probably. People weren't going to scatter them around or smudge them or damage them too much.
Do you think there was an independent function to these works at all? Because we don't always, of course, time is cruel, and so we don't necessarily have all the paintings that Holbein made. So we have some drawings for which there are no subsequent painted portraits and vice versa. But could the drawings, they're so beautiful and captivating, would they have had a life as an independent work of art?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, if the drawings were not used to make painted portraits in some cases, we have lost an awful lot of portrait paintings. I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, not everything survives from the 16th century, and one's always hoping that a few more will turn up at some point. But I think because the drawings were collected together and seem to have been together from Holbein's lifetime, it is difficult to believe that they could have functioned in that separate way as portraits that were commissioned for individuals and taken by those individuals, because how then would they have ended up so quickly in a book together that Henry VIII had? So, I mean, I suppose the only possibility is that he made copies of the drawings and that individuals took copies. But that seems to be a bit less likely, perhaps, and that they are all made as preparatory drawings for lost portraits. But people do debate this a great deal.
One of the questions asks whether the drawing of a quote-unquote unknown woman could be of a male sitter. But of course, there were very specific modes of dress in this period, weren't there? So I think we can feel fairly certain about the identity, even though we don't know the name.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, she's wearing a hat and a high collar, and some of the features of Tudor dress, I mean, are associated with both men and women. But the type of headdress, particularly that men wore, was rather different from that worn by women. So I think we can feel fairly certain in that case that it is a she, that is a female sitter.
Oh, great. Yes, we have a question here in the auditorium.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, Susan. Thank you. Quick question about, Hans Holbein's dedication to being authentic. Oh, there we go. His dedication to being authentic in his portraiture. So I guess I'm a little bit curious about the adjustment to the hairline and also about the squirrel's tail kind of coming up and potentially covering what could have been more definition of cleavage, because clearly when you have a patron paying for the portraiture, they're going to want to have a little bit of say about if it's flattering to them. Some may value that authentic nature, but some definitely, when it's showing to their friends, they want it to be as flattering as possible. So I guess I'm wondering, for the hairline and for the tail coming up between her cleavage, do you think that was at the request of the Lovells because this recessed hairline is more attractive, or do you think he changed it to be more authentic? Whose decision do you think this was to have this hairline change in the tail?
Well, that's a very good, very interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure I absolutely have the answer to that. I would always assume with portraits that the person who commissioned the portrait has a pretty large say in what actually goes on and the way the portrait ultimately looks. So, I mean, with the hairline, perhaps Anne or her husband wanted that hair tidied out of the way. Perhaps they felt that it wasn't quite right. Perhaps she didn't intend to have her hair coming that far outside her cap. And perhaps they asked for that change. With the squirrel tail, I think we're on more difficult territory, really. I mean, I think there's a lot of design that's gone into the way that squirrel tail curves around and up over her breast, as you say. I suppose there's a possibility that Holbein painted or devised the squirrel tail originally a little lower, and they actually wanted it to be made higher in keeping with decorum? I mean, that seems to me a possibility. No, you've raised a very, very interesting question there, I think. I think, the result of a portrait is always a combination of very different factors. And I suppose I've tried to describe the multiplicity of factors that might have gone into the creation of this portrait. And yet in some ways it still defies our explanation. I mean, where is she? Is she indoors or outdoors? He is not showing us exactly what he's seen. He's created something that goes beyond that has other layers of meaning, which distance the whole portrait a little bit from the reality that he has started with. So I think what we finished up with is probably a combination of the Lovells and Holbein together. That may not be a very satisfactory answer to your question.
Well, one of the aspects of this painting that's often remarked upon by viewers here is the reserve with which she's portrayed, this restraint, a seriousness, which is very notable. I wondered if you would say a little bit more about why that was appropriate here, why that may have been the Lovell's, preference. In the exhibition, we can see other portraits of women presumably associated with the court where they engage us directly, much as their male counterparts do.
Yes, I mean, later on, there seem to be quite a few portraits in which women, as you say, engage us directly, which is more unusual for the time. And I'm not quite sure how that developed, whether it's associated with that very frontal portrait of Christina of Denmark that we saw as well. I mean, earlier in his career, Holbein normally showed all of his sitters, whether they were men or women, in three-quarter face, as Anne is here. It seems to be later on that you get those sort of ambiguities of expression, the turning of the eyes to one side, as I showed in the drawing of Mary Zouche. But the way in which she's looking slightly down, she's not engaging with us, it does give her a very contained air. And then I think the way in which the squirrel is turned in the opposite direction, that seems very, very deliberate, even though the squirrel obviously is in the same direction as the heraldic squirrel, so presumably it had to be in that direction. But to me, it does underline that sense of the squirrel being almost more lively, more in our world than Anne, who seems somewhat remote, even though she is so unideal. So she's sort of very engaging while being very withdrawn, I think.
Yes. Let's hear a question from here in the auditorium.
Hi. Can you hear me? So you had mentioned how Holbein did not idealize his subjects, which I think is one of the most wonderful things about his paintings. They're very individual and, as you mentioned, asymmetrical. And we were looking earlier at the portrait of Christina of Denmark, which Holbein had been sent by Henry VIII to paint. And one of the stories that I had heard, which I wonder how correct it is that he was also sent to paint Anne of Cleves. And when he brought the portrait back to Henry, Henry was quite enamored of her, but was very disappointed when he met her in person. And what I wonder is, did Holbein idealize Anne of Cleves? Did Henry just have unrealistic expectations?
Right.
I suspect the latter, but I was interested to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's a very good question. I think with Anne of Cleves, there are two things to say. There's something about portraits and something about what we know about the reception of Anne when she arrived and Henry saw her. So there seem to be all kinds of reasons why Henry disliked Anne. She didn't speak English. there were many, many aspects of her appearance and behavior that he disliked. But Holbein, I think it's noticeable, just carried on being his court painter. Other people got into big trouble. Thomas Cromwell, who arranged that marriage, lost his head. It did not go well for him. So I think we can assume that there wasn't huge displeasure in the likeness, that there wasn't a huge disparity. But I think the really intriguing thing is the headdress that Anne of Cleves wears. It's very different from any of the headdresses that English women were wearing. And the ambassadors at the time said that they were very ugly. They called them monstrous, actually. And Holbein made 2 portraits of Anne for Henry, one of which was a little miniature portrait, which is today in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Really beautiful portrait. But it's very noticeable in that he has diminished, he's reduced that headdress as much as possible compared to the other portrait, compared to what it would have been in reality. He's just focusing on her face. So I think that the headdress and the style of dress was something that Henry and the English just didn't like at all. Poor Anne, you know, she didn't look like them. And so, no, it didn't go well at all. But Holbein was fine. I think his likeness was what was wanted.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have just a few more minutes, so I'll take 1 or 2 more questions here. A broader question about Holbein, looking at some of the other works that you showed, Susan, in your presentation. It's striking to note that both Erasmus and Thomas More are depicted with a vivid green background, I think referring to perhaps to the curtains. Is there a deeper significance there beyond perhaps an artist's affinity for the color? We do see those green curtains a lot.
You do. I mean, in the same way as you see these beautiful spiraling leaves in the backgrounds of the portraits quite a lot. So I think that they are there as a bit of a background device, background filling. What is more interesting, I think, is the occasions where those green curtains, those probably beautiful silk curtains, actually have some kind of pattern or device on them, which is the case in the portrait of the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Wareham, and is also the case in the portrait that I showed you, the great double portrait of the ambassadors, where there's a very elaborate textile there, and where the pattern may actually have some significance. For example, there are diamond rings there, which may be included to symbolize the loyalty of friendship between the 2 men. So I think sometimes those green curtains are fairly minimal and they're there as a bit of a prop, but in other cases, I think they're there to enhance the meaning of the portrait. You have to look closely to see.
Well, here we've extracted the beautiful damask pattern from the back wall of Thomas Cromwell's portrait, and we've used it in the design of the exhibition, it's really interesting to see it alone and as a pattern. Actually, it's a very complex pattern. So for those of us here today on site, we can have a look at that on the walls of the exhibition. Just one last question here, which. With which I think we'll wrap up our program, if I may. There was a question about the reason that we chose to introduce the exhibition with this portrait, and it's a way to thank you, Susan, very much for giving us a much greater insight into this complex and meaningful work. I chose it in part because it's one of my favorite portraits. It's one of the most beautiful portraits among many beautiful portraits by the artist. It symbolizes, I think, the institutional friendship we have with the National Gallery and our work together, but it is a painting that epitomizes Holbein's complex approach to portraiture, a very personal approach where he seems to have a rapport with his patrons, his willingness to make changes, which I find very fascinating. So in a very precisely painted work, we find him making, as in this case, significant adjustments that you've spoken about so beautifully. Also, lots of small adjustments if we look at the figure. For example, the change to the hairline that you mentioned. So it's a way of entering into his world, I think, is how I see it, a sort of portal into Holbein and his realm. So I encourage all of you here today and those who will see the exhibition in New York to spend some time with this marvelous painting. None of us could have had a better guide to a lady with a squirrel and a starling, who is probably Anne Lovell, than you, Susan Foister. So thank you very, very much for so skillfully and so memorably helping us understand this work.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.